Imagine you are sitting beside a prehistoric campfire with a lump of wet clay in your hands. Not a bowl, not a cup, not even a particularly impressive lump of clay. Just sticky earth that is now coating your fingers, your knees, and probably several parts of your body that did not volunteer for this experiment. You squeeze it, it holds a shape. Interesting. Then somebody leaves that shape near the fire. And something strange happens. The soft earth becomes hard. Add water again, and it does not simply collapse back into mud. Heat has changed the material itself. Somewhere inside that transformation lies one of humanity's most useful technological tricks: pottery. The obvious story says this probably happened after farming once people built villages, stored grain, and finally decided prehistoric dinner deserved proper tableware. Except the timeline refuses to cooperate. At Xianrendong Cave in southern China, people were making pottery roughly 20,000 years ago, long before agriculture became the normal explanation for why humans needed pots. So why would mobile hunter-gatherers bother making something heavy, fragile, and extremely easy to drop? And how did ordinary earth become a container capable of surviving fire? The answer begins with something far less glamorous than civilization: mud. The short answer is surprisingly simple. You need the right kind of earth, enough water to shape it, time to dry it, and fire. That is basically pottery. Except, of course, basically is doing heroic amounts of work there. Because you cannot scoop up any random handful of wet dirt, make a bowl, throw it into a campfire, and expect prehistoric IKEA to happen. Pottery depends on clay-rich material. Clay contains extremely fine mineral particles that become plastic when mixed with water, meaning you can squeeze, coil, press, and shape them without the whole thing immediately falling apart. Then comes drying. Water slowly leaves the vessel. If that happens unevenly or too quickly, cracks can form before the pot even reaches the fire. And then comes the dangerous part. Heating does more than simply dry the clay. As temperatures rise, the minerals inside begin undergoing changes that eventually transform the original clay into ceramic. After sufficient firing, adding water does not simply restore the original sticky material. The transformation is effectively irreversible. That sounds almost embarrassingly straightforward to us. Shape it, dry it, burn it, done. But imagine discovering those rules without a thermometer, a kiln manual, or somebody on YouTube explaining why your bowl just exploded. The real technology was not merely putting mud near fire. It was learning which clay worked, how wet it should be, how slowly it needed to dry, and how much heat it could survive. And humans probably learned those rules the expensive way, one broken pot at a time. Before pottery, humans already had fire. That sounds like most of the cooking problem solved. It was not. Fire is excellent when you want to roast meat, char something on a stick, or accidentally turn dinner into charcoal. But some foods become much more useful when heat and water work together. Think roots, tubers, seeds, tough plant tissues, pieces of meat that would prefer to remain pieces of meat forever. Cooking can soften food and, depending on what you are eating, increase the energy your body can obtain from it. Heating with water can also make certain difficult plant foods easier or safer to consume. The problem is that water refuses to stay conveniently above a campfire by itself. Humans already had containers made from materials such as hides, baskets, shells, wood, or stone. Each solved particular problems. But a durable vessel capable of holding liquid while being repeatedly heated opened another set of possibilities. Now you could simmer. You could render fat. You could soften stubborn ingredients. You could extract nutrients into broth. You could combine foods instead of treating every meal like a collection of objects somebody had briefly introduced to fire. And this matters because pottery did not need to make humans better hunters. It could make more of what they already collected worth eating. Suddenly, a lump of clay was not competing with a spear. It was competing with the limitations of the human digestive system. But there is still a problem. If heating water was so useful, humans had other ways to do it. Heated stones could be transferred from a fire into water held inside containers that could not themselves sit directly over flames. So pottery was not invented simply because humanity desperately needed soup. Something else made fired clay worth the trouble. For a long time, pottery fitted beautifully into a very tidy story about civilization. First, humans hunted and gathered. Then they discovered farming. Farming created permanent villages. Villages created stored food. Stored food created the need for containers. And somewhere around that point, somebody invented the pot. It is such a satisfying sequence that you almost feel bad ruining it. Almost. Because in East Asia, the pottery shows up far too early. At Shenrendong Cave in southern China, ceramic fragments date to roughly 20,000 to 19,000 years ago. At Yuchinyan Cave, also in southern China, pottery appears in deposits dating roughly 18,300 to 15,400 years ago. These were not farmers living beside neat fields of grain. They were hunter-gatherers living during the final stretch of the Ice Age. That matters, because it means pottery did not have to wait for agriculture, permanent villages, or warehouses full of cereal. The connection between farming and pottery is real in many later societies. Once people settle down, heavy breakable containers become much less annoying. You can store food, carry water across the yard instead of across a landscape, and accumulate more pots than any reasonable household needs. But farming cannot explain the beginning of pottery everywhere. In parts of East Asia, people were already experimenting with fired clay vessels thousands of years before agriculture became established, which creates a much stranger picture. Imagine being mobile enough that everything you own eventually has to travel with you. Now invent a container that is heavy, fragile, and impossible to fold. That does not immediately sound like progress, unless whatever that pot allowed you to do was valuable enough to justify the inconvenience. And this is where the broken pieces start talking. Now, here is the part nobody expected. A broken pot can remember dinner. Not in some poetic archaeological sense. Literally. When people cooked food inside ceramic vessels, fats from that food could soak into the porous walls of the pot. The meal disappeared. The pot broke. The camp vanished. Thousands of years passed. But some of those chemical traces survived. Archaeologists can analyze these absorbed lipids and sometimes identify broad categories of foods that were processed inside a vessel. Which means a prehistoric potsherd is not just a piece of fired clay. It can also be a very old dirty dish. And dirty dishes, as it turns out, are excellent witnesses. In early hunter-gatherer pottery from Japan, researchers found strong evidence that many vessels were repeatedly used to process aquatic resources. Fish and other foods obtained from marine and freshwater environments were an important part of the story, and that association continued across thousands of years despite major climatic and ecological changes. That does not mean the first pot on Earth was invented for fish soup. Archaeology is rarely that cooperative. Different communities used pottery differently. Residues do not survive equally well in every vessel, and one pot may have processed multiple ingredients during its lifetime. But the clue still matters, because now the fragile pot problem begins to make sense. A ceramic container gives humans another way to simmer, render, combine, and extract useful material from food over extended periods. Small fish, oily tissues, shellfish, bones, tough plants, and other awkward ingredients can be processed in ways that roasting alone does not easily provide. That may sound like a small improvement. It is not. Imagine trying to recover every useful calorie you can from a seasonal catch while living through the unstable environments of the late Pleistocene. Suddenly, the ability to turn awkward ingredients into broth, softened food, or concentrated mixtures starts looking less like prehistoric cuisine and more like survival engineering. And the evidence is powerful precisely because nobody carved a label onto the pot saying, "Fish goes here." They left Greece. We found it thousands of years later. So now we know at least part of what pottery could do. But to understand just how early humans had mastered the technology, we need to return to the caves. At Xianrendong in southern China, archaeologists did not discover a beautiful, complete pot sitting politely on the cave floor. They found fragments, small, broken pieces of ceramic, buried inside ancient deposits. On their own, they do not look revolutionary. They look like the kind of thing you might sweep aside while searching for something more exciting. But the layers around them told a remarkable story. Careful dating placed some of the pottery at roughly 20,000 to 19,000 years ago. That is deep in the late Pleistocene, near the end of the last ice age. And the people associated with this world were foragers, not agricultural villagers. Somehow, communities living under those conditions already knew enough about clay and heat to produce vessels that had been deliberately fired. Now, we have to be careful here. Those fragments do not tell us who first invented pottery. They do not preserve the moment somebody realized that heated clay behaved differently. And they certainly do not come with instructions saying, dry for 3 days, then fire until your neighbor complains about the smoke. What they give us is something more reliable, evidence that by this point, the technological idea already existed. And Xianrendong does not stand completely alone. At Yuchinyan Cave, farther west in southern China, pottery has been dated to roughly 18,300 to 15,400 years ago. Some fragments could be reconstructed into part of a large, thick-walled vessel. That matters because the pattern becomes harder to dismiss as one strange experiment in one cave. People in this region were repeatedly making containers from fired clay at an astonishingly early date. They had crossed an important technological threshold. Earth was no longer just ground, it was raw material. And once humans knew they could reshape the ground itself, dry it, heat it, and make it stay that way, the next question was obvious. What was worth putting inside? Probably not one single thing. But cooking is one of the strongest candidates. A fired clay vessel gives you something remarkably useful, a place where water, food, and heat can remain together for a long time. That sounds obvious because you have spent your entire life surrounded by pots. For a hunter-gatherer, it changes the menu. Instead of only roasting food over flames, you can simmer it. Tough ingredients can soften. Fat can be rendered from animal tissues. Nutrients can move into broth instead of remaining trapped in scraps that are difficult to chew or process. And aquatic foods may have been especially important in some early pottery traditions. As the lipid evidence from ancient Japanese ceramics shows, fish and other aquatic resources were repeatedly processed in pots over long periods. A seasonal catch can now be treated in new ways. Small fish, oily tissues, shellfish, bones, and other awkward ingredients become easier to combine and cook. Basically, pottery lets you stop asking, "Can I roast this?" and start asking, "What happens if I boil it for a while?" Humans could already heat liquids without ceramic pots. Stone boiling is one example. Heat rocks in a fire and transfer them into a container of water. It works. It is also a little like owning a stove that requires you to repeatedly carry pieces of the stove into your soup. Pottery offered another solution. Make the container itself capable of enduring repeated heating. Storage probably mattered too, especially as pottery became more common and communities used it in different ways. But we should not imagine one prehistoric inventor designing the first vessel specifically for grain, fish, stew, or anything else. Different communities could discover different advantages. The important change was broader. Once humans could reliably turn clay into a durable container, they had created a new way to control food, water, heat, and time. And once that trick existed, it did not remain one strange experiment practiced by a few people in southern China. Over time, ceramic technology appeared across wider parts of East Asia, including Japan and the Russian Far East. In many of these early cases, the people using pottery were still hunter-gatherers. That destroys another tempting idea, that every society had to follow the same technological checklist. Hunting, farming, village, pottery. Congratulations. Civilization unlocked. Human history was never that organized. In some regions, pottery became useful while people still depended heavily on hunting, fishing, and gathering. Elsewhere, ceramic vessels later became deeply integrated into farming communities. Same broad material principle. Very different lifestyles. And there probably was no single universal route by which everybody acquired pottery. In some places, techniques may have moved between neighboring populations. Communities could copy useful methods, modify them, or learn from people they interacted with. In other contexts, similar solutions may have emerged through separate traditions of experimentation. The history is not one neat line radiating from a prehistoric pottery headquarters. It is a patchwork. Different clays, different vessel shapes, different firing methods, different foods, different reasons for deciding that this particular kind of breakable object was worth making. What mattered was that humans had discovered a new category of material behavior. Clay could be shaped while wet, transformed by heat, and made durable enough to perform jobs that raw earth could not. Once that principle became part of human knowledge, pottery could be adapted to whatever a community needed. And eventually, humans began doing something very human with useful objects. They started making them mean things. At first, a pot only needs to work, hold water, survive heat, avoid splitting open 5 minutes before dinner. But once people repeatedly make the same technology, something else happens. They have to teach it. Someone learns which clay feels right between the fingers. Someone knows how to prepare it. Someone learns that adding suitable non-clay material to the paste can change how the vessel behaves. Someone knows when a pot has dried enough to approach the fire without turning dinner preparations into a small ceramic disaster. Those decisions become habits. And habits can become traditions. One community might favor a certain vessel shape. Another might prepare its clay differently. People could press fingers, cords, shells, or tools into the surface, creating patterns that were unnecessary for making soup, but very useful for making one pot look different from another. Now, pottery is doing two jobs. It is holding food, and it is carrying information about how people make things. Archaeologists have to be cautious here. A particular decoration does not automatically mean this tribe lived here, and matching pots do not prove that everyone who made them shared one simple identity. Human culture is considerably more annoying than that. But repeated manufacturing techniques and decorative traditions can reveal patterns of learning, contact, and shared practice. A child watching an experienced potter build a vessel is not merely learning how to manufacture a container. They are learning how their community manufactures a container. Over generations, those choices can become recognizable traditions. Pots can participate in exchange, feasting, household routines, displays of skill, and, in some societies, status or ritual behavior. The mud has acquired a biography. What began as a way to control heat and food can eventually help archaeologists trace relationships between people who left no written names behind. And that transformation from useful object to cultural object makes pottery incredibly valuable to archaeology. Unfortunately for the people who actually made it, becoming culturally meaningful did not make pottery any less breakable. Pottery was useful. It was also deeply inconvenient. Before you get a finished vessel, you need suitable clay. You need to prepare it. You need to shape it without building weaknesses into the walls. Then you need to let it dry slowly enough that it does not crack before the exciting part even begins. After that comes firing. More heat, more fuel, more attention. And after all of this, you can still end up with several extremely historical pieces of broken pottery. Ceramics can fail because of uneven drying, thermal stress, poor construction, unsuitable material, or firing conditions the potter did not control well enough. Early potters did not need modern materials science to understand this. They had something much more persuasive: failure. Make enough vessels and you learn which clay behaves well. You learn which wall thickness survives. You learn how long things need to dry. You learn that putting a very wet pot directly into intense heat is an excellent way to turn one container into 12 archaeological artifacts. Then there is mobility. A basket can be light. A hide container can bend. A ceramic pot remains stubbornly pot-shaped no matter how far you need to travel. So the adoption of pottery was never automatically progress. For some communities, in some seasons, the benefits of cooking, processing, storing, or serving food could outweigh those costs. In other circumstances, older container technologies remained perfectly sensible. That is an important point. Humans do not adopt technologies because history is pushing them toward civilization. They adopt them when the trade-offs work. Pottery survived because often enough they did. And once enough generations learned how to manage those trade-offs, turning clay into ceramic stopped being an experiment. It became knowledge. So, what is the real answer? Ancient humans turned mud into pottery by learning to control a sequence of very ordinary things with unusual precision. They found clay-rich earth that could be shaped when wet. They prepared it, formed it into vessels, allowed those vessels to dry, and then exposed them to enough heat for the clay to become ceramic. That part we understand. We also know that people were doing this astonishingly early. By around 20,000 years ago, hunter-gatherers in East Asia were already producing fired clay vessels. What we do not know is the first moment. There is no archaeological scene showing someone accidentally dropping a clay object into a fire and waking up the next morning as the inventor of pottery. That story is possible. It is also just a story. The real discovery may have happened gradually. Clay hardened around hearths. Fragments survived heat. People noticed. Someone tried again. Some vessels failed. Others worked. Techniques improved. Eventually, communities learned to reproduce the transformation deliberately. We can strongly infer that cooking and food processing were important advantages of early pottery. Chemical residues preserved inside prehistoric vessels show that pottery became closely connected with aquatic foods in some hunter-gatherer traditions. But there was probably never one universal reason for making the first pot. And there was almost certainly no single morning when humanity collectively announced that the mud age was over and the pottery age had begun. Pottery was accumulated knowledge, a useful kind of earth, a controlled fire, 1,000 small observations, and probably a truly impressive number of broken bowls. That is how mud became technology. There is a good chance you are using the descendants of that technology right now without thinking about it. Your coffee mug, your cereal bowl, your dinner plate, maybe the tile under your feet, or the ceramic sink you used this morning. They all belong to the same broad technological family as that ugly prehistoric lump beside the campfire. The materials are more carefully selected. The temperatures are better controlled. Modern factories use kilns, precise mineral mixtures, glazes, and equipment that would look suspiciously like wizardry to someone living 20,000 years ago. But the core idea is still recognizable. Take clay. Give it a shape. Remove the water. Use heat to transform it. That simple sequence eventually helped humans cook foods differently, store materials, carry liquids, build traditions, create art, and manufacture everything from bricks to porcelain. And it began with a material so ordinary that most of us spend our lives trying not to get it on our shoes. Mud. Think about that the next time you pick up a ceramic cup. You are holding the descendant of an experiment. Humans began tens of thousands of years ago. An experiment involving earth, fire, patience, observation, and enough failed attempts to fill an archaeological museum. Somebody once looked at wet ground and discovered that fire could make it remember a shape. We have been doing variations of that trick ever since.